The Montana winter of 1882 was merciless, claiming lives faster than the local preacher could dig graves in the frozen ground. But on this particular bone-chilling morning, as snow fell like white death across the abandoned mining camp, a child's desperate sobbing echoed through the empty cabins, a sound that would forever change the life of a broken man who had lost everything. What kind of monsters leave a 7-year-old girl to freeze and starve alone in a ghost town? The answer lay buried in greed so dark it would shock even the hardest frontier souls. Thomas McCready pulled his tattered coat tighter against the biting wind as he guided his weary horse through the skeletal remains of what had once been Copper Falls, Montana. The abandoned mining town stretched before him like a graveyard of broken dreams, its empty buildings standing as monuments to the gold rush that had died as quickly as it had been born. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Snow crunched under his horse's hooves, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of the ghost town. Thomas was a man carrying the weight of unbearable loss. Just 8 months earlier, he had been a different person entirely. A successful rancher with a thriving cattle operation outside Billings, married to his beloved Catherine, and father to 2 bright boys, Samuel and Benjamin, ages 9 and 11. They had lived in a comfortable farmhouse with white-painted shutters and a wraparound porch where Catherine would sit in the evenings, mending clothes while the boys played with their wooden horses in the yard. The fever had come in late spring, sweeping through their region like an invisible plague. Catherine fell ill first, her usual vibrant energy sapped away by the relentless sickness that left her bedridden and burning with temperature. Thomas had ridden 20 miles to fetch the doctor, but by the time they returned, Samuel was showing symptoms too. Within a week, Benjamin had joined his brother in their parents' bed, all 3 of them fighting a battle that Thomas could only watch helplessly from the doorway. The doctor, an elderly man named Harrison, who had seen too much death in his long career, shook his head grimly after examining them. "Scarlet fever," he said quietly, pulling Thomas aside. "I've seen it tear through whole families. All you can do now is pray and try to keep them comfortable." Thomas had prayed. He had bargained with God, offering his own life in exchange for theirs. He had held Catherine's burning hand as she whispered his name in delirium. He had told his boys stories to distract them from their pain, his voice growing hoarser as he watched them grow weaker. But prayer had not been enough. Catherine died on a Tuesday morning in June, her hand going limp in his, just as the sun was rising over their property. Samuel followed her that same evening, and Benjamin, the youngest and strongest, held on for 2 more agonizing days before finally surrendering to the fever that had claimed his entire family. Thomas buried them in the small cemetery behind their local church, standing alone in the rain as the preacher said words that meant nothing to a man whose world had ended. He sold the ranch within a month, unable to bear the sight of the empty house where his family's laughter had once echoed. The money from the sale went into his saddlebags, along with a few personal belongings and the overwhelming weight of survivors. Guilt that threatened to crush him with every breath. For months, he had wandered the Montana Territory aimlessly, taking odd jobs when he needed supplies, sleeping under stars that no longer held any beauty for him. He avoided towns when possible, preferring the honest company of wilderness to the well-meaning sympathies of strangers who couldn't possibly understand the depth of his loss. Now, in the dead of winter, he found himself in Copper Falls purely by accident. He'd been caught in a blizzard 2 days earlier and had taken shelter in an abandoned cabin, waiting for the storm to pass. The town had been a bustling mining operation just 5 years ago, but when the gold vein played out and the mining company pulled up stakes, the residents had scattered like leaves in the wind, leaving behind a collection of empty buildings, slowly surrendering to the harsh Montana weather. Thomas had planned to pass through quickly, but his horse had developed a slight limp that needed rest. As he made his way down what had once been the main street, he noted the eerie stillness of the place. Windows stared like dead eyes from empty storefronts. A saloon sign creaked back and forth in the wind, the painted letters too faded to read. Snow had drifted against doorways, creating natural barriers that sealed off the abandoned buildings like tombs. He was just deciding where to rest his horse when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind whistling through. Broken shutters, but there it was again, unmistakably human and heartbreakingly young. Someone was crying. Thomas reined in his horse and listened intently. The sound was coming from somewhere ahead, muffled but persistent. It was the crying of a child, weak and desperate, and it sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. Following the sound proved more difficult than Thomas had anticipated. The crying would fade and disappear entirely, only to resume moments later from a slightly different direction. The wind played tricks with sound in the empty town, bouncing echoes off abandoned buildings and creating an acoustic maze that led him in circles. After nearly an hour of searching, Thomas finally traced the source to a small cabin at the far end of town, set apart from the other buildings and partially hidden by a grove of bare cottonwood trees. The structure was in better condition than most, with a stone chimney and solid-looking walls, though no smoke rose from the chimney, despite the bitter cold. The crying was definitely coming from inside. Thomas dismounted and approached the cabin, cautiously. As a man who had spent years dealing with cattle thieves and claim jumpers, he had learned to be wary of unexpected situations. But the sound of a child in distress overrode his natural caution. He tied his horse to a nearby tree and made his way to the front door. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap Thomas could see the dim interior of the cabin. The crying had stopped again, replaced by an ominous silence that made his skin crawl. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges protesting with a rusty squeal that seemed unnaturally loud. "Hello?" he called softly. "Anyone there?" The cabin was sparsely furnished with a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace that held nothing but cold ashes. Weak winter sunlight filtered through dirty windows, casting long shadows across the plank floor. For a moment, Thomas thought the cabin was empty, that the crying had been his imagination, or perhaps the wind creating sounds where none existed. Then he saw her. In the far corner of the cabin, partially hidden behind an overturned wooden crate, sat a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She was so still and quiet that she seemed like part of the shadows, but her wide, frightened eyes reflected the dim light like those of a trapped animal. Thomas's heart nearly stopped. The child was clearly in terrible condition. Her dark hair hung in matted tangles around a face that was far too thin, her cheeks hollow with malnutrition. She wore a simple brown dress that was several sizes too large, hanging off her small frame like a tent. Her feet were bare despite the freezing temperature, and Thomas could see that her lips had a bluish tint that spoke of prolonged exposure to cold. Most heartbreaking of all were her eyes, enormous in her gaunt face, filled with a terror so profound that Thomas felt his chest tighten with recognition. He had seen that same look in the eyes of wounded animals, creatures that had been hurt so badly they no longer trusted anything or anyone. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas breathed, immediately dropping to one knee to make himself less intimidating. "Little un, what are you doing here?" The girl pressed herself further back into the corner, if such a thing were possible. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only a tiny whimper emerged. Thomas could see her whole body trembling, though whether from cold, fear, or hunger he couldn't tell. Probably all three. "It's all right," Thomas said in the gentle voice he had once used with his own boys when they had nightmares. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Thomas." What's yours?" Still no response, though the girl's eyes never left his face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Thomas slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of hardtack biscuit, one of the few supplies he had left. He broke off a small piece and held it out to her. "Are you hungry, sweetheart?" The reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The girl's eyes locked onto the food with desperate hunger, but she made no move to take it. Instead, she looked around the cabin frantically, as if expecting someone to appear and punish her for wanting to eat. "It's okay," Thomas said softly. "You can have it. It's yours." Very slowly, moving like someone who expected to be struck at any moment, the girl reached out and took the piece of biscuit. She stuffed it into her mouth immediately, chewing quickly and swallowing before anyone could take it away from her. The desperate way she ate told Thomas everything he needed to know about how long it had been since her last meal. He broke off another piece, then another, watching as the girl devoured each morsel with the ravenous hunger of someone who had been starving. When the biscuit was gone, she looked at him with something that might have been hope flickering in her terrified eyes. "What's your name, little darling?" Thomas asked again, his voice as gentle as he could make it. This time she answered, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Rose. Rose," Thomas repeated, and the girl nodded slightly. "That's a beautiful name. Rose, can you tell me what you're doing here all alone?" Rose's face crumpled and fresh. Tears began streaming down her cheeks. They left me," she whispered. "Said I was too much trouble. Said nobody would want a bad girl like me." Thomas felt a surge of rage so intense it took his breath away. "Who left you, Rose? Who said that to you?" "Uncle Jeremiah and Aunt Prudence," Rose said, the names coming out like a confession of guilt. They said I was cursed, that bad things happen wherever I go." The names hit Thomas like a physical blow. He knew those names, or rather, he knew of them. Jeremiah and Prudence Blackwood were well known throughout the Montana Territory as traveling evangelists who made their living preaching fire and brimstone to frontier communities. They were also known for taking in orphaned children, supposedly, out of Christian charity, though Thomas had always suspected there was more to their operation than simple kindness. "Rose," Thomas said carefully, "are Jeremiah and Prudence your real aunt and uncle?" Rose shook her head. "They said they were, but I don't remember them from before Mama died. They came to the orphanage and said they were family, that they would take care of me." "When did your mama die, sweetheart?" "Last summer," Rose whispered. "She got sick, like everyone else in town. The fever took her, and they put me in the orphanage in Helena. I was there for 2 months before the Blackwoods came." Thomas's mind raced as he pieced together the timeline. Rose's mother had likely died during the same fever outbreak that had claimed his own family. The orphanage in Helena was notorious for being overcrowded and understaffed, and Thomas could easily imagine how desperate they would be to place children with anyone who seemed willing to take them. "How long have you been with the Blackwoods?" he asked. "Since September," Rose said. "They traveled around to different towns, and I had to sit quiet during their preaching and not cause any trouble. But I got sick a few weeks ago, and Aunt Prudence said it was because I had the devil in me. Uncle Jeremiah said I was bringing God's wrath down on their ministry." Thomas felt his hands clench into fists. "What happened when you got sick?" "They stopped feeding me regular meals," Rose said in that same matter-of-fact tone that children used when describing horror as if it were normal. "Said I needed to fast to drive out the evil spirits, and when I cried because my stomach hurt, they said it was proof that Satan was inside me." The picture was becoming clearer, and it made Thomas sick to his stomach. The Blackwoods had been using Rose as a prop in their traveling ministry. probably presenting her as an example of their Christian charity while collecting donations from sympathetic congregations. When she became inconvenient, sick, and requiring actual care, they had decided she was more trouble than she was worth. "Rose, how long have you been here alone?" "I don't know," she said, her voice growing smaller. "A long time. They brought me here 3 days ago and said this was where bad children belonged. They said if I was really sorry for being wicked, maybe God would send someone to help me, but if I wasn't sorry enough..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, the same feeling he'd had when watching his own children suffer. But this time, instead of helpless despair, he felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "Rose," he said firmly, "you are not wicked. You are not cursed. You are a little girl who has been treated terribly by people who should have protected you." Rose stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. "But Uncle Jeremiah said..." "Uncle Jeremiah is wrong," Thomas said with quiet conviction. "Dead wrong, and I'm going to prove it to you." Thomas knew he couldn't leave Rose in the cabin for another moment. The child was clearly suffering from exposure and malnutrition, and the temperature was dropping as evening approached. But he also knew that any sudden movements might terrify her further. So he forced himself to move slowly and speak calmly, despite the urgency he felt. "Rose, I want to take you somewhere warm, where you can have a proper meal and clean clothes. Would that be all right?" Rose looked at him with those enormous, frightened eyes. "Are you going to take me back to them?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "I will never take you back to people who hurt you. That's a promise." But they said, "They're my guardians. They have papers." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Of course they had papers. Legal guardianship would make their operation appear legitimate and give them power over Rose that would be difficult to challenge. But papers didn't make them family, and papers certainly didn't give them the right to abandon a child in a ghost town to starve. "Papers don't matter when people break their promises to take care of you," Thomas said. "What matters is that you're safe and warm and fed. Everything else we can figure out later." Rose considered this for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Okay," Thomas felt a wave of relief. "Good girl. Now, I'm going to pick you up and carry you to my horse. Is that all right?" When Rose nodded again, Thomas gently scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her small body feeling fragile as bird bones beneath the oversized dress. She smelled of unwashed hair and fear, and Thomas felt his heart break a little more as she instinctively curled against his chest, seeking warmth and security that had been denied to her for too long. As he carried her outside, Thomas's mind was already working on practical concerns. The nearest real town was Willow Creek, about 15 miles south, but that was too far to travel with a sick child in winter weather. However, he remembered seeing smoke rising from a chimney about 5 miles back along the trail, probably a line shack or winter cabin occupied by a rancher checking on cattle. "Rose," he said as he settled her carefully on his horse, then climbed up behind her. "We're going to ride to a place where there are good people who can help us. You just hold on tight and try to stay warm, all right?" Rose nodded, her small hands gripping the saddle horn with determination that would have been admirable if it weren't so heartbreaking. Thomas wrapped his coat around both of them as much as possible and urged his horse into a steady but careful pace across the snowy ground. As they rode, Thomas found himself talking to Rose in a low, soothing voice, partly to keep her calm and partly to keep himself from dwelling on the rage that was building in his chest. He told her about his horse, Charlie, and how the animal had been with him for 6 years. He pointed out animal tracks in the snow and explained which creatures had made them. He described the warm meal they would have once they reached safety, and he promised her that she would never have to be cold or hungry again if he had anything to say about it. Rose said little during the ride, but Thomas could feel some of the tension leaving her small body as they put distance between themselves and the abandoned town. Once when Charlie stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, she made a small sound of fear, and Thomas immediately tightened his protective arm around her. "It's all right," he murmured. "I've got you. I won't let you fall." And as he said the words, Thomas realized he meant them in every possible way. This child had been abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect her, left to die alone in a place where no one would ever find her body. But she had survived somehow, and now she was his responsibility, not just for the next few hours or days, but for as long as she needed him. The thought should have terrified him. Thomas had been running from responsibility and emotional connection. Ever since burying his family, he had convinced himself that he was better off alone, that caring about people only led to devastating loss. But holding Rose's small, trusting body against his chest, feeling her gradually stop shivering as his warmth reached her, Thomas felt something he had thought was dead forever. The fierce, protective love of a father. He didn't know how he was going to challenge the Blackwoods' legal guardianship. He didn't know how he was going to provide for a child when he was barely managing to provide for himself. He didn't even know if Rose would want to stay with him once she was truly safe, and had other options. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the little girl in his arms, who had survived abandonment and cruelty through sheer will to live. What mattered was making sure she never felt that abandoned again. As smoke from the distant cabin came into view through the swirling snow, Thomas made a silent promise to his wife and sons, to Rose and to himself. This child would know what it felt like to be loved and protected. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would make sure Rose understood that she was not cursed, or wicked or unwanted. She was precious, and she was home. The cabin Thomas spotted through the swirling snow belonged to Jacob Muller, a German immigrant who had been ranching in the Montana Territory for 15 years. Jacob was a massive man with hands like tree roots and a beard streaked with premature gray, but his eyes held the gentle wisdom of someone who understood suffering. When Thomas knocked on his door, carrying a half-frozen child, Jacob didn't ask questions. He simply stepped aside and gestured them toward the blazing fireplace. "Mein Gott," Jacob breathed in his thick accent, taking in Rose's condition as Thomas carefully set her down near the hearth. "What has happened to this little one?" "She was abandoned," Thomas said simply, unwrapping his coat from around Rose's small frame. "Left to die in Copper Falls. I found her 3 hours ago." Jacob's weathered face darkened with an anger that transformed his gentle features. Who would do such a thing? "People calling themselves her guardians," Thomas replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. "People who convinced themselves that a sick child was more trouble than she was worth." Rose had not spoken during the entire ride to Jacob's cabin, but now she looked up at the two men with those enormous, frightened eyes. Jacob immediately knelt down to her level, his massive frame somehow managing to appear non-threatening despite his size. "Hello, little miss," he said softly, his accent making the words sound like a lullaby. "My name is Jacob. You are safe here. Ja, no one will hurt you while you're in my home." Rose studied his face carefully, then gave the smallest possible nod. Jacob smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made his entire face seem to glow with warmth. "Gut, very gut. Now I think you are hungry, yes? I have soup cooking, good beef soup with vegetables from my garden, and bread, fresh bread I baked this morning." At the mention of food, Rose's stomach growled audibly, and she pressed her hands against her middle in embarrassment. Jacob chuckled gently. "Do not be ashamed of hunger, little one. Hunger means you are alive, and alive is a very good thing to be." Over the next hour, Jacob proved to be exactly the kind of person Thomas had hoped to find. The German rancher moved around his cabin with quiet efficiency, ladling hot soup into wooden bowls and cutting thick slices of dark bread that smelled like heaven. He spoke to Rose in the same gentle tone throughout, never overwhelming her with questions, but keeping up a steady stream of soothing conversation that seemed to gradually relax her rigid posture. Rose ate with the desperate intensity of someone who had learned not to waste any opportunity for nourishment. She finished her first bowl of soup so quickly that Jacob refilled it without comment, then watched approvingly as she consumed a second serving almost as rapidly. Only when she was working on her third bowl did her eating slow to a more normal pace, and Thomas saw some color returning to her pale cheeks. "Better?" Jacob asked when Rose finally pushed her empty bowl away. Rose nodded, then surprised both men by speaking without being prompted. "Thank you," she whispered. "That was the best soup I ever had." Jacob beamed as if she had given him the greatest compliment imaginable. "My Martha, she taught me to cook before she died. She said good food is medicine for both body and soul." "You had a wife?" Rose asked, her natural curiosity beginning to overcome her fear. "Yeah, for 20 years. She died 5 years ago from the lung sickness. But she is still with me, you see." Jacob tapped his chest over his heart. "The people we love, they never truly leave us." Thomas felt his throat tighten at the simple wisdom in those words. He had been so focused on his grief, so consumed by the absence of Catherine and his boys, that he had forgotten the truth Jacob spoke. The love remained, even when the people were gone. As the evening wore on, Rose gradually began to relax in the warmth and safety of Jacob's cabin. The German rancher seemed to have an instinctive understanding of traumatized children, never pushing her to talk, but creating an atmosphere where conversation felt natural and safe. He showed her his collection of wood carvings, intricate animals, and figures that he crafted during the long winter evenings, and was delighted when Rose expressed genuine admiration for his craftsmanship. "You like the horses best?" Jacob asked, noticing how Rose's fingers lingered on a carved mare and foal. "My mama had a horse when I was little," Rose said quietly, "before she got sick. His name was Butterscotch, because he was yellow like butter." "What happened to Butterscotch?" Thomas asked gently. Rose's face fell. "When Mama died, they sold him, along with everything else. They said orphans don't need horses." The casual cruelty of that statement hit both men like a physical blow. Thomas could see Jacob's hands clench into fists, and he felt his own anger rising again at the systematic way Rose had been stripped of everything that connected her to her mother's memory. "Well," Jacob said after a moment, his voice carefully controlled, "perhaps someday you will have another horse, when you are older and in a place where horses are possible." Rose looked at him with something that might have been hope flickering in her eyes. "Do you think so?" "I think," Jacob said solemnly, "that little girls who are brave enough to survive what you have survived can accomplish anything they set their minds to." That night, Jacob insisted that Rose sleep in his own bed while he and Thomas made do with bedrolls near the fireplace. Rose protested weakly that she didn't want to put him out, but Jacob waved away her concerns with characteristic generosity. "A bed should have someone young and innocent in it," he said simply. "It makes the bed happier." As Thomas lay listening to the wind howl outside Jacob's cabin, he heard Rose crying softly in the other room. The sound was muffled, as if she was trying to keep from disturbing anyone, and it broke his heart all over again. Without thinking, he rose and padded quietly to the bedroom doorway. "Rose," he whispered, "are you all right?" "I'm sorry," came her small voice in the darkness. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't wake me, sweetheart. Can you tell me what's wrong?" There was a long pause before Rose answered. "I keep thinking they're going to come back. Uncle Jeremiah and Aunt Prudence. I keep thinking they're going to find me and be angry that I didn't die like I was supposed to." Thomas felt his chest tighten with protective fury. "Rose, listen to me very carefully. Those people are never going to hurt you again. I won't let them." "But you don't know them," Rose whispered. "Uncle Jeremiah says he speaks for God and that God told him I was wicked. What if he's right? What if I really am cursed?" Thomas stepped into the room and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "Rose, do you want to know what I think about curses?" She nodded in the dim light from the dying fire. "I think curses are just things that cruel people make up to explain why they want to be cruel," Thomas said gently. "I think when someone calls a child cursed, it says something terrible about them, not about the child." "But bad things happen around me," Rose insisted. "Mama got sick and died. The Blackwood said their ministry started having problems after they took me in. Maybe I really do bring bad luck." Thomas considered his words carefully. "Rose, my wife and my 2 boys died of fever last year. Does that make me cursed?" Rose sat up in bed, her eyes wide. "You had a family?" "I did. Catherine was my wife, and Samuel and Benjamin were my sons. They were just a little older than you when they died." What happened to them? Thomas told her about the fever, about watching helplessly as his entire world slipped away from him. He told her about the guilt he carried, wondering if there was something he could have done differently, some way he could have saved them. "But you're not cursed," Rose said, with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "You're good. You saved me." "And you're not cursed either," Thomas replied. "You're a little girl who has had terrible things happen to her, but that doesn't make you bad or unlucky. It just makes you someone who needs people to care about her." Rose was quiet for a long moment. "Do you care about me?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I care about you very much." "Even though you just met me?" Thomas thought about his answer. "Rose, sometimes caring doesn't depend on how long you've known someone. Sometimes you just recognize that someone needs you, and you need them, and that's enough." "Do you need me?" The question surprised Thomas with its directness. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I do. I've been very sad and lonely since my family died, and taking care of you makes me feel like maybe I can be helpful to someone again." Rose considered this solemnly. "So we help each other?" "Yes," Thomas said, feeling something settle into place in his chest. "We help each other." The next morning brought a crystal-clear sky and temperatures so cold that the air seemed to crack when you breathed it. Rose woke looking better than she had since Thomas found her. Her cheeks had more color, and her eyes seemed less haunted. Jacob made a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and flapjacks that had Rose staring in amazement at the sheer abundance of food. "Is this really all for us?" she asked, looking between the 2 men as if expecting them to tell her it was a joke. "Every bit of it," Jacob confirmed cheerfully. "Growing children need lots of good food to become strong." As Rose ate, Thomas and Jacob discussed their situation in low voices. The German rancher had spent the night thinking about the legal implications of what Thomas had done, and his conclusions were sobering. "The law, it will not be on your side," Jacob said bluntly. "If these Blackwood people have legal guardianship papers, they have the right to claim the child, even if they abandoned her. So what do I do?" Thomas asked, watching Rose carefully cut her flapjacks into precise squares before eating them. "You need proof of what they did," Jacob said. "Witnesses, evidence, something that shows they are unfit guardians. Who's going to believe the word of a drifter against traveling preachers with legal documents?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "There is someone," he said finally. "Judge Harrison in Willow Creek. He is fair man, but more than that, he has soft heart for children. His own daughter died young, and he has no patience for people who harm little ones. You think he would help? I think he would listen," Jacob said carefully. "But you need more than story. You need proof." As if sensing they were discussing her future, Rose looked up from her breakfast. Are you talking about what's going to happen to me? Thomas exchanged a glance with Jacob, then decided on honesty. Yes, sweetheart. We're trying to figure out how to make sure you stay safe. The Blackwoods will say, I belong to them, Rose said matter-of-factly. They have papers that say so. Rose, Thomas said gently, can you tell us exactly what happened when they left you in Copper Falls? Everything you remember. Rose's face grew somber, but she nodded. Over the next hour, she recounted the events leading up to her abandonment, with a precision that was both impressive and heartbreaking. She remembered conversations, specific words that had been said, even details about the weather and the time of day. As she spoke, both Thomas and Jacob grew increasingly angry at the calculated cruelty of what the Blackwoods had done. They planned it, Jacob said grimly, when Rose had finished. This was not a moment of anger or frustration. They planned to leave her there to die. They said if I was really sorry for being bad, maybe someone would find me, Rose added quietly. But Uncle, Jeremiah said probably no one would come to Copper Falls until spring, when the snow melted. Thomas felt his hands shake with rage. The Blackwoods had essentially sentenced a 7-year-old child to death, then convinced themselves it was an act of divine judgment. The level of self-deception and cruelty involved was staggering. Rose, he said carefully, did the Blackwoods ever hurt you in other ways before they left you in Copper Falls? Rose nodded slowly. Uncle Jeremiah used a switch when I was disobedient, and Aunt Prudence would lock me in dark places when I cried too much. She said it would teach me to control my emotions. What kind of dark places? Closets mostly, sometimes the root cellar. Once they left me in a church basement overnight because I asked for second helpings at dinner. Jacob made a sound like a growl deep in his throat. These people, they are monsters, but they said it was for my own good, Rose said, confused by the men's reactions. They said they were teaching me discipline and godliness. Rose, Thomas said firmly, nothing they did to you was for your own good. Adults who care about children don't lock them in dark places or abandon them to die. What they did was wrong, and it was cruel, and you didn't deserve any of it. Rose stared at him with wide eyes. Really? Really? Thomas said with absolute conviction. You deserve to be loved and protected and cared for. Every child deserves that. For the first time since Thomas had found her, Rose smiled. A real smile that transformed her entire face and gave him a glimpse of the joyful child she had been before trauma and abandonment had stolen her innocence. I like being here with you and Mr. Jacob, she said shyly. I feel safe. You are safe, Jacob assured her, and you will stay safe. Thomas and I, we will make sure of it. As the day wore on, Thomas found himself marveling at Rose's resilience. Despite everything she had endured, she maintained a natural curiosity about the world around her and a capacity for joy that seemed impossible given her circumstances. She helped Jacob with simple chores around the cabin, listened with rapt attention as he told stories about his homeland in Germany, and even laughed when he taught her a silly song in his native language. But Thomas also noticed the ways trauma had shaped her behavior. She ate quickly, as if expecting her food to be taken away. She jumped at sudden noises and watched the door constantly, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. Most heartbreaking of all, she seemed genuinely surprised whenever the men showed her kindness, as if she had learned to expect nothing but harshness from the adults in her life. That evening, as they sat around Jacob's fireplace sharing a dinner of venison stew and fresh bread, Rose asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. What happens tomorrow? Thomas looked at Jacob, then back at Rose. Tomorrow, we're going to ride to Willow Creek to see Judge Harrison. We're going to tell him what happened to you, and we're going to ask him to help us make sure you never have to go back to the Blackwoods. What if he says I have to go back? Thomas felt his jaw set with determination. "Then we'll figure out something else. But I promise you, Rose, you are never going back to people who would hurt you. Not while I'm alive to prevent it." Rose studied, his face in the flickering firelight, and whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "Okay," she said simply. "I trust you." Those 3 words hit Thomas harder than any declaration of love ever had. This child, who had every reason to distrust adults, who had been abandoned and abused by the very people who should have protected her, was willing to put her faith in him. The responsibility was terrifying and humbling in equal measure. As Thomas tucked Rose into bed that second night, she looked up at him with those enormous dark eyes and asked quietly, "Thomas, if Judge Harrison lets me stay with you, would you want me to?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with hope and fear and the desperate need for acceptance that every child carried in their heart. "Rose," Thomas said gently, "if Judge Harrison lets you stay with me, it would make me happier than I've been since I lost my own children. You would be the most precious gift I could ever receive." Rose smiled then, that transformative expression that lit up her entire face, and Thomas felt his heart crack open in a way he had thought was impossible. He was falling in love with this brave, damaged little girl, and the thought of losing her to a legal system that had already failed her once was almost unbearable. But as he watched Rose drift off to sleep, safe and warm and fed, Thomas made a silent promise to his deceased wife and sons. He would fight for this child with everything he had. Rose had survived abandonment and cruelty through sheer force of will, and now it was his turn to prove worthy of her trust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and the terrifying prospect of facing the legal system. But tonight, Rose was safe, and that was enough. It had to be enough, because sometimes, Thomas realized as he listened to Rose's peaceful breathing in the next room, the most important battles were fought not with guns or fists, but with love and determination and the absolute refusal to let innocent people suffer alone. And Rose would never be alone again. Not if Thomas Macready had anything to say about it. The ride to Willow Creek took most of the morning, with Rose bundled warmly between Thomas and Jacob on their horses. The town was larger than Thomas had expected, a proper settlement with a main street lined with businesses, a church with a white steeple, and even a small hotel. Judge Harrison's office was located above the general store, accessible by an external staircase that creaked ominously under their weight. Judge William Harrison turned out to be a man in his 60s with silver hair and intelligent grey eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His office was lined with law books and smelled of pipe tobacco and leather. When Jacob introduced Thomas and explained their situation, the judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a piece of paper. "This is a serious allegation, Mr. Macready," Judge Harrison said when Thomas finished recounting how he had found Rose. "Child abandonment is a criminal offense, but proving it against licensed guardians will require substantial evidence." "What kind of evidence?" Thomas asked, feeling Rose's small hand tighten in his. "Witnesses to the abandonment would be ideal, but failing that, we need documentation of a pattern of abuse or neglect." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Rose with kind eyes. "Young lady, would you be willing to tell me in your own words what happened to you?" Rose looked nervously between Thomas and Jacob, then nodded. For the next 30 minutes, she recounted her experiences with the Blackwoods in careful detail. Judge Harrison listened intently, occasionally asking gentle follow-up questions that revealed he had considerable experience dealing with traumatized children. "Rose," the judge said when she finished, "you've been very brave in telling me all of this. I want you to know that I believe every word you've said." Rose's eyes widened in surprise. "You do?" I do indeed. In my experience, children don't make up stories about being locked in dark places or having food withheld. Adults who harm children often claim that children lie, but the truth is usually quite obvious to anyone willing to listen. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps on the external staircase made everyone in the room freeze. Through the window, Thomas could see 3 familiar figures ascending toward the judge's office. Jeremiah Blackwood, a tall man with cold eyes and a perfectly groomed beard. His wife Prudence, a thin woman with pinched features and an expensive dress. And a younger man Thomas didn't recognize, probably in his 20s, with the soft look of someone who had never done hard physical labor. "They found us," Rose whispered, pressing herself against Thomas's side. Judge Harrison stood up, his expression becoming professionally neutral. "Mr. McCready, take Rose into my private chambers through that door. Stay there until I call for you." Thomas wanted to protest, to face the Blackwoods immediately, but he recognized the wisdom in the judge's suggestion. Rose was trembling with fear, and a direct confrontation might traumatize her further. He guided her quickly into the small, adjoining room, just as heavy knocks sounded on the office door. Through the thin walls, Thomas could hear every word of the conversation that followed. "Judge Harrison," came Jeremiah Blackwood's voice, smooth and confident, "I understand you have our ward in your custody. We've come to collect her and take her home where she belongs." "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Harrison replied evenly, "please have a seat. I'd like to discuss young Rose's situation with you." "There's nothing to discuss," Prudence Blackwood interjected, her voice sharp with irritation. "The child is our legal ward. We have documentation proving our guardianship, and we demand her immediate return." "I see. And where exactly has Rose been for the past several days?" There was a pause that stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Jeremiah spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Rose has behavioral problems, Your Honor. She's prone to running away when she doesn't get her way. We've been searching for her since she disappeared from our camp." "Disappeared from your camp," Judge Harrison repeated slowly. "Can you be more specific about the circumstances of her disappearance?" "The child had one of her episodes," Prudence said quickly. "Screaming, throwing things, completely out of control. We were camped near Copper Falls, preparing for a revival. Meeting when she ran off into the woods. We searched for hours, but couldn't find her in the storm. In the adjoining room, Rose made a small sound of distress." Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, whispering reassurances, while his anger built at the blatant lies being told just feet away. "I see," Judge Harrison said. "And you're certain she ran away on her own?" "Absolutely certain," Jeremiah replied, firmly. "The girl has severe emotional disturbances stemming from her mother's death. She often creates elaborate fantasies to explain her behavior. We've been trying to help her, but she requires constant supervision." "Constant supervision," the judge mused. "Yet somehow she managed to slip away from your camp and disappear into a blizzard." Thomas could hear the skepticism in Judge Harrison's voice, and apparently so could the Blackwoods, because Jeremiah's tone became more defensive. "Judge Harrison, with all due respect, we didn't come here to be interrogated about our parenting methods. We came to collect our ward and return her to proper Christian guidance. The man who has her now, this McCready person, has no legal right to keep her." "Actually," Judge Harrison said calmly, "Mr. McCready found Rose abandoned in Copper Falls, nearly dead from exposure and starvation. He saved her life." "The child was never abandoned," Prudence snapped. "She ran away, as I've explained. If this McCready person had any decency, he would have brought her directly to the authorities instead of harboring a runaway." "Perhaps we should ask Rose herself what happened," Judge Harrison suggested. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, the third man, who Thomas assumed was their son or associate, spoke for the first time. "Your Honor, surely you're not going to take the word of a disturbed child over that of licensed guardians." The girl is known to have episodes where she loses touch with reality. Any story she tells about being abandoned is clearly a product of her mental instability. Thomas felt Rose stiffen beside him. Through the crack in the door, he could see her small hands clenched into fists, her face pale with suppressed emotion. "Mental instability," Judge Harrison repeated. "Do you have medical documentation of this alleged condition?" "We've consulted with various spiritual advisors," Jeremiah said. "The child clearly has evil influences affecting her behavior. We've been attempting to drive out these influences through prayer and discipline." "What kind of discipline?" Another uncomfortable pause. "Biblical discipline, Your Honor. The scriptures are quite clear about sparing the rod and spoiling the child." "I see. And this biblical discipline included locking her in dark places when she cried." "Where did you hear such nonsense?" Prudence demanded. "The child has filled your head with lies, just as we warned you she would." "So you're denying that you ever confined Rose to closets or basements as punishment?" "We provided appropriate consequences for inappropriate behavior," Jeremiah said carefully. "Sometimes that required removing her from situations where her outbursts might disturb others." Judge Harrison's voice grew cold. "Mr. Blackwood, in my experience, when adults start using euphemisms like appropriate consequences and removing from situations, they're usually trying to hide abuse." "How dare you suggest—" Prudence began, but the judge cut her off. "Furthermore, I find it interesting that Rose supposedly ran away into a blizzard, yet when she was found, she was wearing only a thin dress and no shoes. What kind of disturbed episode involves a child removing her shoes before running into a snowstorm?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Thomas could practically feel the Blackwoods scrambling for an explanation. "The child often removes her clothing during her episodes," the younger man said quickly. "It's part of her disturbed behavior. And you made no attempt to pursue her when she ran barefoot into a blizzard." "We searched extensively," Jeremiah insisted, "but the storm was too severe. We had to think of our own safety as well." "Of course," Judge Harrison said dryly. "Your own safety. Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, how exactly did you learn that Rose had been found?" Another pause. "Word travels quickly in small communities, Your Honor. We heard rumors and came immediately to collect her." "Rumors, I see. And these rumors reached you where exactly?" "We were conducting ministry work in the area." Thomas could hear the uncertainty in Jeremiah's voice. The man was clearly making up his story as he went along, and Judge Harrison was systematically dismantling each lie. Ministry work. In the middle of winter. In isolated ranch country. Judge Harrison's skepticism was now openly apparent. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to be direct with you. I've heard Rose's account of what happened to her, and it differs significantly from yours. According to her, you deliberately drove her to Copper Falls and ordered her out of your wagon, telling her that no one would want a bad child like her." "That's a complete fabrication," Prudence shrieked. "The girl is mentally unwell. She creates these elaborate stories to get attention." "Mrs. Blackwood, please lower your voice. Now, if Rose is as mentally unstable as you claim, why were you so eager to get her back? Surely finding appropriate medical care would be more important than maintaining custody." The question caught the Blackwoods off guard. Thomas could hear shuffling and whispered conversation before Jeremiah responded. "We have a Christian duty to care for the child, regardless of her difficulties. We made a commitment to her late mother, to provide her with proper guidance." "Her late mother. Tell me about your relationship with Rose's mother." She was a member of our congregation. Before she died, she begged us to take care of Rose." "I see. And this conversation took place where?" "In Helena, Your Honor, at the hospital where Sarah was being treated." Judge Harrison was quiet for a moment, and Thomas could hear the scratching of a pen on paper. Mr. Blackwood, I'm going to be investigating your claims thoroughly. In the meantime, Rose will remain in the temporary custody of Mr. Macready while I determine what's in her best interests. You have no right. Jeremiah's voice rose dangerously. We have legal guardianship papers. The child belongs to us. The child belongs to no one, Mr. Blackwood. She is a human being deserving of protection and care. If your guardianship papers are legitimate, which I intend to verify, they still don't give you the right to abandon or abuse her. We demand to see the child immediately, Prudence insisted. She needs to be reminded of her obligations to us. Mrs. Blackwood, Rose is a 7-year-old child. She has no obligations to you beyond basic respect, which frankly you haven't earned. You will not be seeing her today. Thomas heard chairs scraping as the Blackwoods stood up. This is an outrage, Jeremiah declared. We'll be contacting territorial authorities about your conduct, Judge Harrison. This Macready person has clearly influenced you with his lies. You're welcome to contact whoever you like, Mr. Blackwood. In the meantime, I suggest you find lodging in town. I'll want to speak with you again tomorrow, after I've had time to review your documentation and make some inquiries. Heavy footsteps moved toward the door, then Jeremiah's voice came again, lower and more menacing. Judge Harrison, I want you to understand something. That child is cursed. She brings misfortune to everyone around her. If you insist on keeping her from us, you'll discover that for yourself soon enough. Is that a threat, Mr. Blackwood? It's a warning, Your Honor. Some children are born with evil in their hearts. We've been trying to save her soul, but if you prefer to learn the hard way about her true nature, that's your choice. The door slammed shut, and Thomas could hear the Blackwoods' heavy footsteps descending the external staircase. After a few moments, Judge Harrison called them back into the main office. Rose was trembling violently, her face white with terror. "They're going to take me back," she whispered. "They said I belonged to them." Judge Harrison knelt down in front of her chair, his expression gentle but determined. "Rose, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Those people lied to me repeatedly during that conversation. They claimed you ran away, but they couldn't explain why you had no shoes. They said they searched for you, but they couldn't explain how they knew you'd been found. Most importantly, they couldn't provide any believable explanation for how a disturbed child managed to escape their supervision during a blizzard. But they have papers," Rose said miserably. "Papers can be forged, young lady. And even if they're legitimate, guardianship can be revoked if the guardians prove unfit." Judge Harrison stood up and moved to his desk. "Mr. Macready, I'm going to issue a temporary custody order placing Rose in your care while I investigate this matter thoroughly. But I need you to understand that this is just the beginning. The Blackwoods won't give up easily, and they may have more resources than we initially thought." "What kind of resources?" Thomas asked. "Money, for one thing. Their clothes are expensive, and they mentioned contacting territorial authorities. That suggests they have connections and influence beyond what you'd expect from simple traveling." Preachers, Jacob, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Judge, there is something else. The way they talked about the child being cursed, about evil in her heart. This is not normal religious thinking. This sounds like people who make money from fear." Judge Harrison nodded grimly. "I had the same thought. Traveling evangelists who specialize in casting out demons and cleansing cursed children can make substantial profits from superstitious communities. If that's their game, Rose would be valuable to them as a prop in their performances." The thought made Thomas sick. "You mean they want her back, so they can use her to scare people into giving them money?" "It's possible. A genuinely traumatized child who flinches and cries on cue would be perfect for convincing audiences that demonic possession is real and that the Blackwoods have special powers to combat it." Rose had been listening to this conversation with growing horror. "Is that why they kept me?" she asked in a small voice. To make money. Thomas immediately knelt beside her chair and took her hands. Rose, it doesn't matter why they wanted you. What matters is that you're safe now, and we're going to keep you safe. But what if they take me away? What if the territorial authorities believe them instead of you? Judge Harrison answered before Thomas could respond. Rose, I've been a judge for 23 years, and I've dealt with my share of charlatans and child abusers. The Blackwoods made several critical mistakes during our conversation that revealed their true nature. They're not going to fool anyone who's paying attention. What mistakes? Thomas asked. First, their story about Rose running away doesn't hold water. No child runs barefoot into a blizzard during a mental episode. That's not how psychological disturbances work. Second, they knew exactly where to find her, which means they've been watching your movements. Third, and most damning, they showed no genuine concern for her welfare. Real guardians who had lost a child would be frantic with worry and grateful beyond measure to find her safe. The Blackwoods were angry and demanding, treating Rose like property they wanted returned. Rose looked up at the judge, with something approaching hope in her eyes. So you're not going to make me go back to them? Not if I can help it, child. But I need you to be brave a little longer while we build a case to permanently remove you from their custody. How long will that take? Thomas asked. Weeks, possibly months. The territorial legal system moves slowly, especially when dealing with custody disputes. In the meantime, you'll need to be very careful. The Blackwoods struck me as the type of people who might try to take Rose by force if legal channels don't work in their favor. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Let them try. Judge Harrison studied Thomas's face carefully. Mr. McCready, I can see that you care deeply about Rose's welfare, but I need to ask you a difficult question. Are you prepared for the responsibility of raising a traumatized child? The legal battle alone will be expensive and emotionally draining, and Rose will need specialized care to help her recover from what she's endured. Thomas looked down at Rose, who was watching him with those enormous, trusting eyes. Judge Harrison, 6 months ago, I was ready to die. I had lost everything that mattered to me, and I saw no reason to keep living. Then I found this little girl abandoned in a ghost town, and suddenly I had a reason to fight again. I can't promise I'll be a perfect father, but I can promise that I'll love her and protect her with everything I have. Rose's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire appearance. Really? You want to be my papa? Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. More than anything in the world, sweetheart. Judge Harrison watched this exchange with obvious approval. Very well then, I'll draw up the temporary custody papers immediately, but remember what I said about being careful. The Blackwoods are dangerous people, and they're not going to accept defeat gracefully. As if summoned by the judge's warning, the sound of angry voices drifted up from the street below. Through the window, Thomas could see Jeremiah Blackwood addressing a small crowd that had gathered around their wagon. His voice carried clearly in the cold air. Friends, we've come to this town in pursuit of a lost child, a poor, disturbed girl who has been led astray by forces beyond her understanding. The man who claims to be helping her is actually enabling her delusions and preventing her from receiving the spiritual guidance she desperately needs. Several townspeople were nodding along with Jeremiah's words, and Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. The Blackwoods were already working to turn public opinion against him. They're good at this, Judge Harrison observed grimly. This isn't their first time manipulating a community. What do we do? Thomas asked. We prepare for war, the judge replied, because that's exactly what this is going to be. The investigation began within hours of the confrontation at Judge Harrison's office. While Thomas took Rose to the boarding house for the night, Judge Harrison dispatched telegrams to Helena, Butte, and 3 other territorial towns where the Blackwoods claimed to have conducted ministry work. Meanwhile, Jacob rode hard to his neighbor's ranch, seeking witnesses who might have seen suspicious activity around Copper Falls. What they discovered over the next 48 hours painted a picture far darker than anyone had imagined. The first breakthrough came from Helena, where the territorial orphanage director, Mrs. Margaret Ashford, responded to Judge Harrison's telegram with information that made Thomas's blood run cold. The Blackwoods had indeed taken custody of Rose, but under circumstances that were highly irregular. According to Mrs. Ashford's records, Jeremiah and Prudence Blackwood had arrived at the orphanage, claiming to be distant relatives of Rose's deceased mother, Sarah. They provided documentation showing they were Sarah's cousins and had traveled from Colorado upon hearing of her death. But when Mrs. Ashford checked with Sarah's former landlord and neighbors, no one had ever heard of any relatives named Blackwood. Sarah had spoken frequently about having no living family, which was one of her greatest fears about dying and leaving Rose alone. The landlord distinctly remembered Sarah saying that Rose's father was unknown and that she herself was an only child whose parents had died years earlier. Despite these red flags, the orphanage had been so overwhelmed with children from the fever epidemic that they had accepted the Blackwoods' documentation without thorough verification. Mrs. Ashford admitted in her telegram that they had been desperate to place children with anyone who seemed willing to care for them, and the Blackwoods had presented themselves as devout Christians with excellent references. Judge Harrison immediately fired back a request for copies of all documentation the Blackwoods had provided, as well as the names of their references. What came back 2 days later confirmed his worst suspicions. 3 of the 4 references were completely fictitious addresses, and the 4th was a small church in Colorado whose pastor had never heard of the Blackwoods. Meanwhile, Jacob's investigation in the surrounding ranching community yielded equally disturbing information. A homesteader named Patrick O'Malley, whose property bordered the road to Copper Falls, reported seeing a covered wagon heading toward the ghost town on the morning Rose claimed she had been abandoned. Most significantly, O'Malley had seen the same wagon return several hours later with 1 fewer passenger than when it had arrived. "I thought it was odd at the time," O'Malley told Jacob. "Copper Falls has been empty for near 3 years now. Ain't no reason for folks to go there, especially in winter. When I saw them come back with what looked like 2 people instead of 3, I figured maybe they'd left someone to check on one of the buildings or something. But it stuck in my mind as strange." Even more damning was the testimony of Samuel Winters, a trapper who maintained cabins throughout the territory. Winters had encountered the Blackwoods twice in the past year, both times in circumstances that had left him deeply uncomfortable. The first encounter had been in a small mining town where the Blackwoods were conducting what they called a spiritual cleansing of a young boy they claimed was possessed by demons. The kid couldn't have been more than 10 years old, Winters told Judge Harrison when summoned to testify. Skinny as a rail, covered in bruises, and scared of his own shadow. The Blackwoods had him up on a makeshift stage, claiming he was filled with evil spirits that only they could drive out. They were charging folks $2 a head to watch this exorcism, and the boy was terrified out of his mind. Winters described how the exorcism had consisted mainly of Jeremiah Blackwood shouting biblical verses, while Prudence held the boy down and poured cold water over his head. The child had been crying and begging them to stop, but the Blackwoods claimed his protests were actually demons speaking through him. "What happened to the boy?" Judge Harrison asked. "That's the strange part," Winters replied. "I stayed in town for 3 days conducting business, and on my last day I saw the Blackwoods loading up their wagon to leave. The boy wasn't with them. When I asked around, folks said the child had been cleansed and sent to live with a good Christian family in another town, but nobody could tell me which family or which town." The second encounter had been even more disturbing. Winters had come across the Blackwoods camped in a remote area, apparently between towns. They had a different child with them this time, a girl of perhaps 12 years old, who was chained to their wagon wheel like an animal. They said she was dangerous, Winters explained, his face grim with the memory. Claimed she had violent episodes and might hurt someone if not restrained, but the girl didn't look violent to me. She looked starved and beaten down. When I questioned them about the chains, Jeremiah got real hostile and said it was none of my business how they dealt with their ward. "Did you report this to any authorities?" Thomas asked. Winters shook his head shamefully. "There wasn't any law within 50 miles of where we were, and the Blackwoods had papers showing they were the girl's legal guardians. I figured it wasn't my place to interfere, but it's bothered me ever since." As these testimonies accumulated, a clear pattern emerged. The Blackwoods were running an elaborate fraud, claiming guardianship of orphaned or abandoned children and then using them as props in fake spiritual performances that generated substantial income. When the children became too difficult to manage, either through illness, trauma, or simple growth into adolescence, the Blackwoods would dispose of them through placement with Christian families that almost certainly didn't exist. Rose's case was unique only in that she had survived her intended disposal. The Blackwoods had clearly expected her to die in Copper Falls, eliminating any witness to their crimes while allowing them to claim she had been called home to heaven after being successfully cleansed of evil spirits. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, the territorial medical examiner who traveled from Butte to examine Rose, provided the final piece of evidence that would prove crucial in the legal proceedings. Her examination revealed a pattern of injuries consistent with systematic abuse, partially healed fractures in Rose's ribs, scars on her back from what appeared to be whip marks, and signs of prolonged malnutrition that went far beyond the effects of her recent abandonment. "This child has been severely mistreated for an extended period," Dr. Thornton reported to Judge Harrison. "The rib fractures are at least 2 months old, and the scarring suggests repeated beatings over several months. The malnutrition is chronic, indicating that withholding food was used as a regular form of punishment." Most damning of all were the ligature marks on Rose's wrists and ankles, evidence that she had been restrained with ropes or chains on multiple occasions. "These marks are consistent with the child being bound for extended periods," Dr. Thornton explained. "The pattern suggests she was frequently tied up, probably as punishment or to prevent escape attempts." When Dr. Thornton showed Thomas the examination results, he had to leave the room to compose himself. The thought of Rose enduring such systematic cruelty while the Blackwoods convinced themselves they were doing God's work made him physically ill. But Rose's response to the examination surprised everyone. Instead of being traumatized by having to recount her injuries, she seemed relieved that adults were finally taking her seriously. "Does this mean people will believe me now?" she asked Dr. Thornton with heartbreaking hope. "Uncle Jeremiah always said nobody would believe a lying, wicked child like me." "Sweetheart," Dr. Thornton replied gently, "these injuries don't lie. Anyone who sees this evidence will know exactly what happened to you." During this investigation period, Thomas found himself dealing with a different kind of challenge. Rose's gradual adjustment to safety and normalcy. After months of abuse and neglect, she struggled to understand that she was truly free from the Blackwoods' control. She hoarded food compulsively, hiding pieces of bread and fruit under her mattress, just in case. She flinched whenever Thomas raised his voice, even in casual conversation. Most heartbreakingly, she constantly apologized for normal childhood behavior, asking for a second helping at dinner, making noise while playing, even laughing too loudly. "I'm sorry," she would whisper whenever she thought she had done something wrong. Please don't lock me up. I'll be good, I promise. Thomas quickly learned that reassurance wasn't enough. Rose needed proof that her new life was real and permanent. He began involving her in decisions about their daily routine, asking her opinion on what to have for breakfast or which books to read together. He made sure she understood that his affection wasn't conditional on her behavior, that she didn't have to earn love through perfect obedience. The breakthrough came when Rose accidentally broke a cup while helping clear the dinner table at the boarding house. She immediately dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she begged Thomas not to punish her. "Please don't hit me," she sobbed. "I didn't mean to break it. I'll be more careful, I promise." Thomas knelt beside her and gently helped her to her feet. "Rose, look at me," he said softly. "Accidents happen. Breaking a cup doesn't make you bad, and it certainly doesn't mean you deserve to be hurt." But Uncle Jeremiah said, "Uncle Jeremiah was wrong about everything," Thomas said firmly. "Good fathers don't hit children for accidents. Good fathers help clean up messes and make sure nobody gets hurt by the broken pieces." Together, they swept up the shattered cup, and Thomas showed Rose how accidents were just part of life, something to be handled calmly and without blame. It was a small moment, but Thomas could see something shift in Rose's understanding of how families were supposed to work. Meanwhile, the Blackwoods were conducting their own campaign to regain custody of Rose. They had taken rooms at the town's hotel and were systematically visiting local businesses and the church, telling their version of events to anyone who would listen. Their story painted Thomas as a delusional drifter who had kidnapped a disturbed child and was preventing her from receiving necessary spiritual treatment. Jeremiah Blackwood proved to be a masterful manipulator, combining biblical quotations with careful suggestions that questioned Thomas's motives for wanting to keep a young girl. To people who didn't know the full story, the Blackwoods' concerns could seem legitimate. After all, what single man would take on the responsibility of raising someone else's traumatized child unless he had ulterior motives? The situation came to a head when Reverend Michael Patterson, the local Methodist minister, approached Judge Harrison with concerns that had been raised by his parishioners. "I'm not questioning your judgment, William," Reverend Patterson said carefully, "but some folks are wondering about this McCready fellow. He's a stranger with no ties to the community, and the Blackwoods seem like sincere Christian people who are genuinely concerned about the child's welfare." Judge Harrison had been expecting this conversation. "Michael, let me ask you something. If a child came to you covered in bruises and ligature marks, claiming she had been beaten and starved and abandoned to die, would you believe her?" "Well, of course, but no buts," Judge Harrison interrupted. "I've seen Dr. Thornton's examination results. This child has been systematically abused for months. The Blackwoods' sincere Christian concern involved beating a 7-year-old with whips and chaining her up like an animal." Reverend Patterson's face went pale. "Surely you're exaggerating." "I wish I were. Would you like to see the medical evidence? The photographs of her injuries?" The minister shook his head quickly. "No, that won't be necessary. I had no idea." "Of course you didn't. The Blackwoods are professionals at hiding their true nature. They've been traveling from town to town, collecting orphan children and using them in fake spiritual performances to generate income. When the children become inconvenient, they dispose of them. Dispose of them. Rose isn't the first child they've abandoned, Michael. She's just the first one who survived long enough to tell her story." That conversation marked a turning point. In public opinion, Reverend Patterson was well respected in the community, and when he began quietly sharing the truth about Rose's condition with his congregation, support for Thomas and opposition to the Blackwoods grew rapidly. The final blow to the Blackwoods' credibility came when Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived from Helena with a warrant for their arrest. The territorial authorities had discovered that the Blackwoods were wanted in Colorado for fraud and suspected child trafficking. Their ministry was a front for an operation that acquired vulnerable children and either exploited them for profit or sold them to buyers in remote areas where questions weren't asked. "We've been tracking them for over a year," Sheriff Bradley explained to Judge Harrison. "They've taken at least 6 children from various orphanages and institutions using forged documents. Rose is the first child we've been able to recover, alive." The news that 5 other children had likely been murdered by the Blackwoods sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. Suddenly, no one questioned why Thomas had acted to protect Rose, and the Blackwoods found themselves completely isolated. But Jeremiah and Prudence Blackwood weren't finished fighting. On their final night in town, before Sheriff Bradley could arrest them, they made one last desperate attempt to reclaim Rose. Thomas was reading to Rose in their room at the boarding house when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside their door. Careful, deliberate footsteps that didn't belong to any of the regular guests. He immediately motioned for Rose to hide under the bed, then positioned himself between the door and where she lay concealed. The door burst open without warning, and Jeremiah Blackwood stepped into the room, carrying a length of rope. Behind him, Prudence held a burlap sack that was clearly intended to muffle Rose's cries. "Where is she?" Jeremiah demanded, his eyes wild with desperation. "We know she's here." "She's under the protection of the territorial court," Thomas replied, calmly, though his hand was moving slowly toward the gun at his hip. "You have no legal right to be here." "Legal right?" Prudence laughed harshly. "That child belongs to us. We invested months of work in training her, and we're not going to let some drifter steal our property." The word property confirmed everything Thomas had suspected about how the Blackwoods viewed Rose. She wasn't a child to them, she was livestock to be exploited for profit. "Get out," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone prepared to use violence if necessary. "We're not leaving without the girl," Jeremiah snarled, taking a step forward. "She's ours, and we'll take her by force. If necessary." That was when Thomas drew his gun, not pointing it directly at the Blackwoods, but making it clear that he was armed and willing to defend Rose with lethal force if required. "I said get out." For a tense moment, the 3 adults faced each other in the small room, while Rose remained hidden under the bed. Probably terrified, but smart enough to stay silent. Finally, Prudence grabbed Jeremiah's arm. "It's not worth dying." "Over," she hissed. "We'll find other children." The casual way she dismissed Rose's value, as if traumatized orphans were interchangeable commodities, revealed the true depths of their depravity. These people weren't just criminals. They were predators who viewed vulnerable children as nothing more than tools for generating income. As the Blackwoods backed toward the door, Jeremiah turned back with one final threat. "This isn't over, McCready. That child is cursed, and she'll bring you nothing but misery. You'll regret the day you interfered with God's will." "The only thing I regret," Thomas replied steadily, "is that it took so long for someone to stop you." After they left, Thomas helped Rose out from under the bed and held her while she cried with relief. Sheriff Bradley arrived 20 minutes later with a deputy, but by then the Blackwoods had fled town, leaving behind only their abandoned wagon and the crushing weight of their crimes. "We'll catch them," Sheriff Bradley promised. "They can't run forever, and now we have enough evidence to hang them for murder if we prove what happened to those other children." But Thomas barely heard him. His attention was focused entirely on Rose, who was clinging to him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had repeatedly betrayed her trust. "Are they really gone?" she whispered against his chest. "They're really gone," Thomas confirmed, "and tomorrow we're going to make sure they can never hurt you or any other child ever again." 3 weeks after the Blackwoods fled Willow Creek, the formal custody hearing took place in the territorial courthouse in Helena. The ornate building, with its high ceilings and polished wooden benches, seemed imposing enough to intimidate anyone. But Thomas felt a quiet confidence as he sat beside Rose, watching her swing her legs from the chair that was too tall for her. Small frame. She wore a new blue dress that Mrs. Henderson from the general store had insisted on making for her, and her hair had been carefully braided by the boarding house owner's daughter. For the first time since Thomas had found her, Rose looked like what she was, a normal, healthy 7-year-old girl. Territorial Judge Marcus Whitman presided over the hearing, a stern man in his 50s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see straight through any attempt at deception. He had reviewed all the evidence gathered during the investigation, including Dr. Thornton's medical report, the witness testimonies, and the damning documentation that proved the Blackwoods had been operating under false pretenses for years. The hearing began with Judge Whitman addressing the assembled court. This case involves allegations of severe child abuse, abandonment with intent to cause death, fraud, and suspected murder. The defendants, Jeremiah and Prudence Blackwood, have fled the jurisdiction and are currently wanted by territorial authorities on multiple charges. In their absence, this court will determine the permanent custody arrangement for the minor child Rose. Thomas's attorney, Jonathan Crawford, presented their case methodically. Crawford was a middle-aged lawyer from Helena who specialized in family law and had agreed to represent Thomas pro bono after learning about Rose's situation. He was thorough and passionate, painting a clear picture of how Thomas had saved Rose's life and provided her with the love and stability she desperately needed. "Your Honor," Crawford began, "Mr. McCready found this child abandoned in a ghost town during a blizzard, nearly dead from exposure and starvation. The people who were supposed to protect her had left her to die because they considered her inconvenient to their fraudulent business operation. Mr. McCready didn't hesitate to risk his own safety to save her, and in the weeks since, he has demonstrated the kind of unwavering commitment that defines true parenthood." Crawford called several witnesses to testify on Thomas's behalf. Jakob Mueller spoke about Thomas's character and his obvious devotion to Rose's welfare. Dr. Thornton testified about Rose's physical and emotional improvement since being placed in Thomas's care. Sheriff Bradley described the extensive criminal investigation that had revealed the Blackwoods' pattern of acquiring and exploiting vulnerable children. But the most powerful testimony came from Rose herself. Judge Whitman had initially been reluctant to put a 7-year-old through the stress of testifying in court, but Rose had insisted she wanted to speak. When called to the witness stand, she needed a wooden box to reach the microphone, but her voice was clear and strong as she told her story. "The Blackwoods said they were my family, but they never acted like family," Rose said, her small hands folded carefully in her lap. "They hurt me when I cried, and they didn't feed me enough food, and they said I was wicked and cursed. But Mr. Thomas, Papa Thomas, he saved me from the cold place where they left me to die. He takes care of me and reads me stories and never hurts me, not even when I break things by accident." Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly. "Rose, do you understand what adoption means?" Rose nodded solemnly. "It means Papa Thomas would be my real papa forever, and I would be his real daughter forever, and nobody could take me away from him." "Is that what you want?" "More than anything in the whole world," Rose said with absolute conviction. "Papa Thomas makes me feel safe and loved, just like my first mama did before she got sick." Judge Whitman smiled, the first time his stern expression had softened during the proceedings. "Thank you, Rose. You've been very brave today." The opposing side was represented by a territorial prosecutor who was obligated to ensure that all proper procedures had been followed, even though the Blackwoods themselves were fugitives. Prosecutor William Hayes was a competent but unimaginative man who focused primarily on the technical aspects of the case rather than its emotional content. "Your Honor," Hayes argued, "while we don't dispute that Mr. McCready's intentions are admirable, the fact remains that he has no prior experience as a guardian, no permanent residence, and limited financial resources. The state has a responsibility to ensure that adopted children are placed in stable, established homes with families who have been properly vetted through official channels." Hayes called a territorial social worker, Mrs. Frances Whitmore, to testify about proper adoption procedures and the importance of thorough background investigations. Mrs. Whitmore was a well-meaning but rigid woman who seemed more concerned with paperwork than with Rose's actual welfare. The standard protocol requires prospective adoptive parents to undergo extensive screening, including financial verification, character references, and psychological evaluation, Mrs. Whitmore explained. Mr. McCready, while clearly well-intentioned, has bypassed all of these safeguards. Judge Whitman listened patiently to these arguments, but Thomas could see that he was not particularly impressed by the bureaucratic concerns. When Mrs. Whitmore finished her testimony, the judge asked a pointed question. "Mrs. Whitmore, what would have happened to Rose if Mr. McCready had followed your standard protocols?" "Well, she would have been returned to her legal guardians while the investigation proceeded." "You mean returned to the people who had abandoned her to die?" Mrs. Whitmore faltered. "The allegations against the Blackwoods weren't known at the time, but they would have been discovered eventually through your thorough investigation process." "Eventually, yes, but how long does your investigation process typically take?" 6 to 18 months, depending on the complexity of the case. Judge Whitman nodded grimly. "So Rose would have spent 6 to 18 months back in the custody of people who were systematically abusing her, while your department conducted paperwork reviews and background checks." Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed. "Your Honor, we have procedures. For a reason, yes, and those procedures failed Rose completely," Judge Whitman said sharply. "Your department placed her with the Blackwoods without properly verifying their claims, and you would have sent her back to them without investigating her allegations of abuse. Mr. McCready accomplished more in 3 weeks than your entire department. Managed in 8 months. The judge's criticism of the Territorial Social Services Department sent a clear message about where his sympathies lay." Thomas felt a surge of hope, but he also knew that the legal system could be unpredictable, and nothing was certain until the final ruling was announced. The hearing continued with additional character witnesses for Thomas. Reverend Patterson testified about Thomas's integration into the Willow Creek community and his obvious dedication to Rose's welfare. Several local businessmen spoke about Thomas's honesty and work ethic during his brief time in their town. Most surprisingly, Mrs. Ashford from the Helena Orphanage traveled to the hearing to speak on Thomas's behalf. "Your Honor," Mrs. Ashford said, "I have been working with orphan children for 15 years, and I have seen many placements succeed and fail. What I observe in Mr. McCready and Rose is something that cannot be created through paperwork or procedures. It's a genuine bond of love and trust. Rose has flourished under his care in ways that would have been impossible in any institutional setting." Mrs. Ashford went on to describe the chronic overcrowding and understaffing at the Territorial orphanages, painting a grim picture of children warehoused in inadequate facilities with minimal individual attention. Her testimony made it clear that even the best institutional care was no substitute for a loving family environment. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Prosecutor Hayes attempted to question Rose's credibility by suggesting that her traumatic experiences might have affected her judgment and memory. "Your Honor," Hayes said, We must consider that this child has been through severe trauma that could have impaired her ability to accurately recall events or make sound decisions about her own welfare. Judge Whitman's response was swift and sharp. Mr. Hayes, are you seriously suggesting that a 7-year-old who survived abandonment and abuse is somehow less qualified to speak about her own experiences than adults who weren't present for any of the events in question? I'm simply pointing out that traumatized children sometimes develop unhealthy attachments. Mr. Hayes, the judge interrupted, I've read Dr. Thornton's psychological evaluation of Rose. She specifically notes that Rose's attachment to Mr. McCready shows all the characteristics of healthy bonding, not trauma-induced dependency. The child has made remarkable progress in his care, which suggests that her judgment about what makes her feel safe and loved is quite sound. As the hearing drew to a close, Judge Whitman called for closing arguments. Prosecutor Hayes made a perfunctory statement about the importance of following proper procedures and ensuring adequate oversight of adoptive placements. His heart clearly wasn't in the argument, and his presentation felt more like a bureaucratic obligation than a genuine belief that Rose would be better off elsewhere. Thomas's attorney, Jonathan Crawford, delivered an impassioned closing argument that brought tears to several spectators' eyes. Your Honor, this case is ultimately about a simple question. What serves the best interests of Rose? The evidence is overwhelming that Mr. McCready has provided this child with something that no institution, no matter how well-intentioned, can offer: the unconditional love of a father who would rather die than see her harmed. Rose was thrown away like garbage by people who saw her as nothing more than a tool for making money. Mr. McCready saw her as a precious child, deserving of protection and love. The choice between bureaucratic compliance and genuine caring should be obvious. Crawford concluded by reading a letter that had arrived that morning from Sheriff Bradley, who was still pursuing the Blackwoods across 3 territories. The letter contained devastating information about the criminal couple's true scope of their crimes. We have now confirmed that the Blackwoods were responsible for the deaths of at least 7 children over the past 3 years. Sheriff Bradley had written they would acquire orphaned or abandoned children through fraudulent documentation, exploit them in fake spiritual performances until they became inconvenient, then dispose of them in remote locations. Rose is not just a survivor. She's the key witness who will help us ensure these monsters face justice for their crimes. The letter went on to describe how the Blackwoods had been tracked to a remote cabin in Wyoming, where they had been arrested along with 2 other children, a boy and girl who were in similarly terrible condition to Rose when Thomas had found her. The rescue of these children was directly attributable to Rose's courage in speaking out about her experiences. When Crawford finished reading the letter, the courtroom was completely silent. Judge Whitman sat quietly for several minutes, reviewing his notes and apparently weighing all the testimony he had heard. Finally, he looked up and addressed the court. This case presents a clear contrast between rigid adherence to bureaucratic procedures and responsive action to serve a child's genuine needs, Judge Whitman began. While I have great respect for the importance of proper adoption protocols, I cannot ignore the fact that those very protocols failed Rose catastrophically. She was placed with criminals who saw her as merchandise, and the system that was supposed to protect her nearly got her killed. The judge's voice grew stronger as he continued. Mr. McCready, on the other hand, saw a child in mortal danger and acted decisively to save her life. In the weeks since, he has demonstrated exactly the kind of commitment, patience, and love that every child deserves. Rose has thrived under his care, recovering not only physically but emotionally from trauma that would have broken many adults. Judge Whitman paused, looking directly at Rose, who was sitting very still and listening intently to every word. Rose, You have shown remarkable courage throughout this ordeal. You survived abandonment and abuse. You found the strength to trust again, and you spoke truthfully about your experiences even when it was frightening to do so. Your testimony today has been clear, consistent, and convincing. This court believes every word you have said, and this court is proud of your bravery." Thomas felt Rose's small hand slip into his, and he squeezed it gently, trying to convey through that simple touch all the love and pride he felt for this extraordinary little girl. "Therefore," Judge Whitman announced, "this court hereby terminates any remaining legal relationship between Rose and the fugitives Jeremiah and Prudence Blackwood. Furthermore, this court grants full and permanent adoption rights to Thomas McCready. Effective immediately. Rose, you are now legally and permanently the daughter of Thomas McCready, with all the rights and protections that relationship entails." The courtroom erupted in applause, but Thomas barely heard it. He was too busy looking down at Rose, whose face was glowing with a joy so pure and complete that it took his breath away. "Really?" she whispered. "Really and truly forever?" "Really and truly forever," Thomas confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. Rose launched herself into his arms with such force that she nearly knocked him off his chair. "Papa!" she cried, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "You're my real papa now." As Thomas held his daughter, he felt the last. Pieces of his broken heart finally clicked back into place. He had lost everything once, but somehow the universe had seen fit to give him the most precious gift imaginable. The chance to be a father again, to love and protect and guide a child who needed him as much as he needed her. After the official paperwork was completed and they emerged from the courthouse into the bright Montana sunshine, Rose looked up at Thomas with those enormous dark eyes that had first captured his heart in an abandoned cabin. "Papa, what happens now?" Thomas smiled down at her, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Now we go home, sweetheart. We build a life together. We make memories and celebrate birthdays and maybe even get you that horse you've been dreaming about." "Real horse? Just for me?" "A real horse, just for you. After all, every ranch needs horses, and we're going to need a ranch with plenty of room for you to grow up safe and happy." Rose's eyes went wide with excitement. "We're going to have a ranch? We're going to have whatever makes you happy," Thomas promised, "because that's what families do. They take care of each other and build a future together." As they walked down the courthouse steps, hand in hand, Thomas caught sight of Jacob Müller waiting by their wagon, his weathered face split by an enormous grin. The German rancher had insisted on making the trip to Helena for the hearing, declaring that he wouldn't miss seeing his little Rose officially become part of Thomas's family. "So," Jacob called out as they approached, "how does it feel to be a legal papa?" "Like the luckiest man in Montana territory," Thomas replied honestly. "And you, little miss?" Jacob asked Rose. "How does it feel to have a papa who will never let anyone hurt you again?" Rose considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "It feels like being safe," she said finally. "It feels like being home." 2 years later, on a warm spring morning in 1884, Rose McCready stood on the porch of their newly built ranch house, watching her father break in a young colt in the corral. At 9 years old, she had grown tall and strong, her dark hair now shining with health and her eyes bright with the confidence that came from knowing she was deeply loved and completely safe. The ranch they had built together stretched across a beautiful valley 15 miles south of Willow Creek, with rolling pastures dotted with cattle and horses, a clear stream running through the property, and mountains rising majestically in the distance. Thomas had used the money from selling his original ranch, combined with a loan from the Territorial Bank, to purchase the land and stock it with quality livestock. But the real treasure of their ranch wasn't the cattle or horses. It was a family they had created together. "Papa, you're going to spoil Thunder if you keep being so gentle with him," Rose called out, laughing as the spirited young horse Thomas was training seemed more interested in playing than working. "Thunder needs to learn that humans can be trusted," Thomas replied, patting the colt's neck affectionately. "Some lessons can't be rushed." It was a philosophy that had guided their entire life together. Thomas had never tried to force Rose to forget her traumatic past or pretend that the Blackwoods had never existed. Instead, he had patiently helped her work through her fears and memories, celebrating every small victory as she gradually healed from the wounds that had been inflicted on her young soul. The nightmares had been the hardest part. For months after the adoption, Rose would wake up screaming, convinced that the Blackwoods had found her and were dragging her back to that cold, dark place where they had left her to die. Thomas would hold her until the terror passed, reminding her over and over that she was safe, that he would never let anyone hurt her again. Gradually, the nightmares became less frequent, replaced by dreams of horses and wide-open spaces, and the secure knowledge that she would wake up in her own room, in her own house, with her own father making breakfast downstairs. The scared, hollow-eyed child who had been found in that abandoned cabin was now a confident young girl who helped with ranch work, attended the local school, and had even started giving riding lessons to other children in the area. "Rose, come, help me with this stubborn boy," Thomas called, as Thunder decided that rolling in the dirt was more appealing than following commands. Rose vaulted over the porch railing with the easy athleticism of a child who had grown up around horses and wide-open spaces. She approached Thunder with the confident but respectful manner that Thomas had taught her, speaking to the young horse in the gentle voice that seemed to calm even the most skittish animals. "Now, Thunder, you know Papa is just trying to teach you important things," she said, stroking the colt's nose. "The sooner you learn them, the sooner you can run free in the big pasture with the other horses." Thunder immediately quieted under Rose's touch, and Thomas shook his head in amazement. "I swear that girl has magic in her hands when it comes to animals." "It's not magic," Rose said seriously, leading Thunder through a perfect figure-8 pattern that Thomas had been trying to teach him for days. "It's just understanding that scared things need patience and kindness, not force." The wisdom in her words, born from her own experiences with fear and healing, never failed to humble Thomas. Rose had taken the worst experiences of her young life and somehow transformed them into compassion for other creatures who were afraid or hurting. Their ranch had become something of a sanctuary, not just for horses, but for other children who needed help. Word had spread throughout the territory about the man who had saved an abandoned child and given her a loving home, and several times over the past 2 years they had taken in youngsters who needed temporary care while more permanent solutions were found. There was Jimmy, a 10-year-old boy whose parents had died in a mining accident, who stayed with them for 6 months until his aunt and uncle could travel from California to collect him. There was little Mary, barely 5 years old, who had been found wandering alone after an Indian raid on her family's isolated homestead. She lived with them for a full year before a distant relative was located back east. Most recently, they had welcomed Carlos, a 14-year-old Mexican boy who had been working as virtual slave labor for a brutal rancher until Sheriff Bradley rescued him. Carlos was still with them, helping with the ranch work and slowly learning to trust that not all adults would exploit his vulnerability. "Miss Rose," Carlos called from the barn where he was mucking out stalls. "Your mare, Sunshine, she is favoring her left front hoof again." Rose immediately handed Thunder's lead rope to Thomas and hurried toward the barn. Sunshine was her own horse, a beautiful Palomino mare that Thomas had given her for her 8th birthday. The horse had been wild and traumatized when they first acquired her, having been mistreated by previous owners, but Rose had patiently worked with her until they formed an unbreakable bond. "Let me see, girl," Rose murmured, running her hands down Sunshine's leg with the expertise of someone who had spent countless hours learning about horse care. "Carlos, could you bring me the hoof pick? I think she's got a stone caught in her shoe." Thomas watched from the corral as his daughter expertly examined her horse, talking to Sunshine in soothing tones while she worked. It was moments like these that reminded him how far they had both come from that terrible winter day when he had found a broken child hiding behind a wooden crate in an abandoned cabin. The legal aftermath of their case had continued long after the adoption was finalized. The Blackwoods had eventually been captured and tried for their crimes, with Rose's testimony being crucial in securing their convictions. Jeremiah Blackwood was sentenced to hang for the murders of 5 children, while Prudence received life imprisonment for her role in the criminal enterprise. The 2 children rescued from their final hideout had been successfully placed with loving families, thanks in large part to the precedent set by Rose's case. Judge Harrison had used their story to push for reforms in the territorial child welfare system, and new protocols were established to prevent fraudulent guardianships and ensure proper investigation of abuse allegations. Rose had become something of a celebrity in legal circles, though Thomas was careful to shield her from too much attention and allow her to live as normal a childhood as possible. "Papa!" Rose called excitedly from the barn. "Come see what I found!" Thomas hurried over to discover Rose kneeling beside Sunshine's stall, where a tiny barn kitten was curled up sleeping on a pile of hay. The kitten couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, clearly orphaned and in need of care. "Can we keep him?" Rose asked, though she was already cradling the tiny creature against her chest with the gentle care that came naturally to her. "He needs a family." Thomas looked at his daughter's hopeful face and felt his heart swell with love and pride. Despite everything she had endured, Rose's first instinct was always to help creatures who were lost or hurting. She had taken the trauma of abandonment and transformed it into a mission to ensure that nothing else would ever have to feel as alone and frightened as she once had. "Of course we can keep him," Thomas said, reaching out to stroke the kitten's tiny head. "Every ranch needs a good barn cat. What are you going to name him?" Rose considered the question seriously, holding the kitten up to examine his markings. "Hope," she said finally. "His name is Hope, because that's what you gave me when you found me. Hope that things could get better." As the sun set over their peaceful valley that evening, Thomas sat on the porch swing with Rose curled up beside him, the tiny kitten sleeping in her lap. Carlos was teaching Jimmy how to play guitar, their music drifting across the yard where sunshine and thunder grazed contentedly in the pasture. "Papa," Rose said quietly, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found me?" "That day," Thomas considered the question carefully. "I try not to think about that, sweetheart. What matters is that we did find each other and we built something beautiful together." "I think Mama sent you to me," Rose said, with the quiet certainty of a child who had found peace with her past. "My first mama, I mean. I think she knew I needed a papa who would understand about being sad and scared, and who would be patient enough to help me learn how to be happy again." "Maybe she did," Thomas agreed, pulling his daughter closer. "And maybe my Catherine and the boys helped guide me to you, because they knew I needed a little girl who would teach me how to love again." As stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, Thomas reflected on the miraculous chain of events that had brought them together. He had been a broken man, convinced that his life was over, when fate led him to an abandoned child who needed him just as desperately as he needed her. Together, they had built not just a ranch but a family, a place where lost and hurting creatures could find healing and hope. The little girl, who had once been left to starve by cruel guardians, was now a confident young woman who radiated kindness and strength. And the struggling widower who had lost everything had discovered that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest challenges. Their story had begun with abandonment and despair, but it had become a testament to the transformative power of love, proof that families aren't just born, they're chosen, and that the bonds forged through shared trials can be stronger than blood itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.